On the evening of October 22nd, 1962, at 7 o'clock, the major television networks interrupted their regular programming and broadcast a single announcement. The President of the United States would address the nation in 1 hour on a matter of the highest urgency. No further details were given. No explanation was offered. The announcement ran on every channel simultaneously, which had never happened before in peacetime, and the people watching it understood immediately that whatever was coming was not routine. By 8 o'clock, virtually every American family that owned a television set was sitting in front of it. Families who did not own televisions went to neighbors who did. Bars turned up the volume and went quiet. Factory workers clustered around break-room sets. In the 13 days that followed, American families did something that has never been fully documented and is almost never discussed. They prepared, not in panic. In the deliberate, systematic way that a generation raised on civil defense drills and government pamphlets and community preparedness classes knew how to prepare. What they did in those 13 days is one of the most remarkable stories of civilian resilience in American history, and almost none of it appears in the history books. The history books tell the Kennedy story. They tell the Khrushchev story. They tell the ExComm story. The secret meetings, the naval blockade, the back-channel negotiations, the photographs from the U-2 spy plane that started it all. What the history books do not tell is what happened in the houses, what your parents said to each other after the children were in bed on October 22nd, what your mother put in the grocery cart on October 23rd, what your father checked in the basement that evening, what the two of them decided quietly without telling the neighbors in case they were wrong about how serious it was. This is that story. Kennedy's address lasted 18 minutes. He told the American public that the Soviet Union had installed offensive nuclear missile sites in Cuba, 90 miles from the Florida coast. He told them the United States was imposing a naval blockade. He told them he had demanded the missiles be removed. And he told them, in language that left no ambiguity about what he meant, that a nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. When he finished, the screen went dark for a moment before regular programming resumed. In living rooms across the country, nobody moved. The grocery stores opened the next morning to lines that had formed before dawn. By mid-morning on October 23rd, shelves in cities across the eastern seaboard were stripped of canned goods, bottled water, rice, flour, and sugar. Hardware stores sold out of batteries. Pharmacies reported unusual demand for aspirin and first aid supplies. Gas stations had lines stretching around corners as families filled their tanks and their spare cans. Civil defense offices, which had been quiet for years, were flooded with telephone calls asking the same questions. Where is the nearest shelter? What should we stock? How much time would we have? The operators answered as many calls as they could. They had not been staffed for this volume. What is important to understand about those grocery runs is that they were not irrational. The families standing in those lines were not panicking. They were implementing, imperfectly and under pressure, exactly the preparation that the Federal Civil Defense Administration had been teaching them for a decade. They were doing what the pamphlet said. They were doing what the community classes had recommended. They were doing what the government had told them to do, and discovering with a clarity that no drill had produced, that they had not done enough of it in advance. The Civil Defense Program had been telling American families to maintain a 14-day food supply since 1951. Community coordinators had knocked on doors. Pamphlets had been distributed. Classes had been held in church basements and school gymnasiums. Most families had attended and nodded and gone home and done approximately nothing. October 23rd, 1962, was the morning they understood why the government had been asking. Banks across the country reported unusual withdrawal activity on October 23rd and 24th, not runs, nothing so dramatic as that, but steady, quiet withdrawals of amounts larger than typical, $50, $100, $200 in cash. Families who had lived through the Depression understood something that the post-war generation was learning for the first time, that cash in hand meant options, that a savings account was only useful if the bank was open. Some of the people standing in those bank lines had been children during the Depression. They did not need anyone to explain to them why cash mattered when the future was uncertain. Churches reported record attendance in the final week of October 1962. Not just Sunday services, weekday masses, Wednesday evening services, informal prayer gatherings organized by congregants without prior announcement. Priests and ministers across the country described something they had not seen since the Second World War. People arriving at church not out of habit, but out of genuine need. Some came with children, some came alone, some knelt in the pews for an hour without speaking to anyone, and then left without explanation. Pastors who had been preaching to half-empty churches found themselves standing before congregations that overflowed into the aisles and spilled onto the front steps. The specific quality of that October, the particular weight of knowing that the decision being made in Washington and Moscow would determine whether there was a November, produced a kind of stillness in American communities that people who lived through it have described for the rest of their lives as unlike anything before or since. Schools continued to operate through the 13 days, but the atmosphere inside them was unlike any ordinary October. Teachers who had been conducting duck and cover drills as perfunctory routine exercises suddenly found themselves conducting them with an intensity that communicated something different to the children, something that the children understood even if no one said it directly. Some teachers broke from curriculum entirely and spent class periods answering questions. Some answered honestly. Some did not know how to answer at all. Some kept teaching fractions and sentence diagrams because keeping to the ordinary was the only comfort they had to offer. Children came home with questions their parents had been asking themselves. What would happen if the missiles came? How long would they have? Whether the basement was deep enough? Some parents answered. Some changed the subject. Some sat down at the kitchen table with their children and explained as clearly as they could what the Civil Defense Program had taught them about what to do. Those conversations are among the most vivid memories that generation carries. On October 24th, Soviet ships carrying additional equipment toward Cuba reached the edge of the United States naval blockade and stopped. They sat there, engines running in international waters, for hours. In Washington, Secretary of State Dean Rusk had not slept in 2 days. He turned to his aide McGeorge Bundy and said the words that have since become historical shorthand for how close it came. We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. What Rusk did not say, and what the history books rarely record, is what was happening in American homes during those same hours. Families had gathered around radios. Fathers who had served in Korea or the Second World War sat very still with a stillness that their children recognized as different from ordinary quiet. Mothers kept the younger children occupied with tasks and questions designed to direct attention elsewhere. The particular silence of those hours, the hours when the Soviet ships were stopped at the line and nobody in the world knew what would happen next, is something the people who lived through it have described with a physical specificity that has not faded in 60 years. October 27, 1962, was the day that those who study nuclear history call Black Saturday. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot. Separately, an American Navy vessel dropped practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine operating in the area. The submarine's crew had been cut off from communication with Moscow for days. They had no way of knowing the depth charges were a signal and not an attack. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo with authorization to use it if the crew believed war had begun. 3 officers had to agree. 2 agreed. The third, a senior officer named Vasily Arkhipov, said no. The torpedo was not launched. The world did not end on a Saturday afternoon in October. Almost none of the families gathered around their radios that evening knew any of this. They knew only that the crisis was not over and that it was Saturday and that their children needed to eat dinner and be put to bed. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. Kennedy confirmed the agreement publicly. The crisis was over. In living rooms across the country, people exhaled in a way that they had not exhaled in 6 days. Some families opened bottles that had been sitting in cabinets. Some went to church. Some simply sat for a while in the particular quiet of a danger that had passed. And then, over the days and weeks that followed, they put back what they had taken out of the cabinets. They rotated the canned goods back to their regular pantry shelves. They spent the cash they had withdrawn. They stopped listening to the radio every hour. What they did not do, and this is the part of the story that matters most, is forget. The generation that sat in front of their television sets on October 22, 1962, and listened to a president tell them that the world might end, did not forget what that felt like. They did not forget the lines at the grocery store. They did not forget the churches packed on a Tuesday morning. They did not forget the specific quality of their children's questions at the kitchen table. For the rest of their lives, many of them maintained a habit of preparedness that they could not always explain to their children or their grandchildren. A little extra in the pantry, a little cash on hand, a plan, spoken or unspoken, for what they would do if it came to that again. Not because they expected it to, because they knew now that it could. The 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis produced no casualties on American soil. No missiles were launched. No cities were destroyed. By any conventional measure of historical events, nothing happened. 13 days of tension resolved into an agreement and a collective exhale and a gradual, careful return to ordinary life. But the people who had lived through those 13 days as adults, who had stood in the grocery lines and sat in the churches and lain awake at 2 in the morning, listening to a radio that offered no reassurance, would have told you, if you had asked them directly, that something had happened. Something had been revealed about the fragility of the world they lived in. Something had been understood at a level below argument or analysis that could not be ununderstood. The particular knowledge that comes from 13 days of genuine uncertainty is not the kind of knowledge you find in a history book. It is the kind your parents carried quietly for the rest of their lives. And yet the people who lived through those 13 days as adults, who sat in those living rooms and stood in those grocery lines and knelt in those church pews, describe it as the most frightening experience of their lives, not because of what happened, because of what they understood for 13 days was possible. Your parents were among those people. The specific knowledge they carried out of October 1962 about what to store and where to go and how to talk to children about things that cannot be fully explained was knowledge that no pamphlet had given them. It was knowledge that 13 days of genuine uncertainty had written into them directly, and it belongs to you.